Hi, my name is Nyla. I work for NYU out of the Steinhardt School. And my question is, what responsibility do African Americans in particular have in advocating for the needs of Africans and for holding the U.S. accountable for foreign policies affecting Africa? Is that even a fair question? And are there visible national African American organizations that do this work now?
Mr. Glover.
Um, when I'm the board chair of Trans Africa Forum for too long now, and one of the ideas visions that I had was beyond apartheid, beyond the liberation movements, and that African Americans need to have some place where there was a very enriched dialogue about what was happening on the continent. Unfortunately, that place, because of I think the extraordinary presence of the anti-apartheid movement, and then subsequently the redemocratization of Haiti, those took up so much space that I don't think we ever were able to kind of latch on to that vision and sustain that kind of vision. Even though Trans Africa Forum has been doing work around with Afro descendants in the region, certainly they're understanding that there are more than 150 million Afro descendants in this region, the southern region. We've been and certainly with the uh, exciting moment of reimagining democracy within the region, that certainly we've been there, whether we were in Venezuela or Colombia or Brazil, or the relationship that we've tried to develop. And another part of that and particularly in terms of Afro descendants in this region, is the role that labor unions could play and have played in this region. And some the role that they had played in the past was not a very complementary relationship. The ILWU, not the ILW, excuse me, the various, the AFL-CIO and others had not played and not had a relationship that we would want to celebrate. Often that was relationship that they had was with government agents such as the State Department and the CIA, et cetera, over historically. But we've been able to trying to find a way, and that's a major, and we're going to need young minds to kind of come up with this, find a way in which we can engage this dialogue that Manchi has instituted right here, that is initiated right here, around the role that we play in supporting those movements around progressive issues within Africa. I remember going to the World Conference on Racism in 2001, and there were a number in 2001 in Durban. We see a South Africa that's just merely just 7 years with the election of Mandela. But I remember the kind of energy that young women's organizations had, and in their discussions and panel groups and panels and such, and talked about the role that they had to play, even as they began to move past what I would refer to as post Mandelaism, because there's a whole thing around Mandela and the image of Mandela. But they were saying that we had to deal with some of the issues now that are critical. I mean, I remember reading in an article in the paper with a group of drivers, drivers, truck drivers, and transportation workers, and were on strike. And when Mbeki was the president, he said that those strikes were a threat to democracy. it almost it's almost inconceivable that here's a movement that felt that workers going on strike, that powerful, they're using their powerful and their power and their voice at the time with threat to the whole to democracy. So I think even as our young people began to see the changes that they expect, the expectations not being realized, the expectations with the end of apartheid not being realized. But Trans-Africa Forum, the problem is that when you have an issue like the movement of the end of apartheid, which brings in a number of players along the way, whether those players are institutional players who and corporations and people who see that it's safe for them to embrace the idea. Once you come down the road and talk about the real structural issues, the issues that over the last 20 years now, 20 years since that first election, 20 years seem to be persistent and seems to have the ANC and the political apparatus have no answers to, then you begin to need the kind of resources necessary from wherever we get those from grassroots organizations, from individuals, etc., to begin to call a spade, to begin to find, not only identify the issue itself, but also begin to develop ideas around how do we deal with these particular issues. So I think for me, Trans-Africa Forum still is the only one of its kind still. It is not AfriCare, or it's not some of the other organizations that deal with Africa. But basically, we've lost the initiative to a certain extent. We could not translate that whole idea of apartheid to a critical analysis of what was happening on the continent, and we need that more than ever right now.
Well, just very briefly, because I know it's getting late, and there are a number of people who have questions. I think that that connection between African Americans in the U.S. and people on the continent, it can't happen from individual to individual. I think we often fall into neoliberal notions of how to create connections. It has to be a connection of movement to movement, and we have to recognize that we have perhaps more to learn from movements in Africa than we have to teach. So we have to kind of reverse the hierarchies. The assumption is always that, oh, we're going to help those poor Africans, right? Because we know better. But there are so many amazing movements. As Danny was saying, women's movements against violence against women, movements against homophobia, and that is a major issue in Africa. Movements for food security, and we participate in that that effort to build solidarity by recognizing that we are not necessarily the ones, we are definitely not the ones who have the answer. So we build solidarity from movement to movement, organization to organization, learning how, and this is absolutely essential, to take leadership from people on the ground who are doing the work there already.
So I apologize. I have two questions, so we'll have to get back in line.
Identify yourself.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, my name is Daniel Cox. How you doing, Mr. Glover, Ms. Davis? First, I just kind of want to say, our first question being, seeing as though we, live in the system of global capitalist white supremacy, with three classifications of people being white supremacists, who benefit from it, non-whites who are usually the targets, whites who are expendable as well. We've had countless leaders, of the quote unquote black community, who have, about a good four, who have, tried to charge the United States with, genocide charges. One mainly being W.B. Du Bois, as well as Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, so on and so forth, right? And then you have laws that are in place, such as the Scott versus Emerson
The way
decision.
you go, I'm gonna limit you to one question.
Okay, yeah. Very sorry.
So-
Yeah, I just want to know, like, how come that can't, like, necessarily be in place put into place today? Why we can't necessarily, charge the United States with genocide instead of just one person rising up, to get shot down while everybody goes towards doing the same thing. If like countless people come up and, I think, also, I love the fact that all the elders, they come out and they all the elders they come out and they talk about everything. But I would like for there to be a chance of maybe like the younger generation of those that like don't necessarily know it. A lot of them have ignorance towards not wanting to learn anything from elders. They usually want to hear something
So,
from there.
so you ask one clear
Okay,
question.
right.
Genocide. We
Yeah.
already heard it. So
Yeah, all
we
right.
get that. Can
That
we move
works.
on to the other people?
Yes,
Thanks.
sir.
So that's a
Thanks.
very clear
All right,
question. Let's get the other questions and at least two more. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. How you doing, Danny Glover, Mr. Glover? My name is Robert Ramos, and I'm a first generation American, and my parents are from Cuba, and my grandfather spent 13 years in prison for disagreeing with the politics there, and I was just wondering what your view on what's going on in Venezuela, where students are being shot in the head, and simply because they are protesting peacefully uh, towards what Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro have done in the past.
The Venezuela question. Okay. Let's get one more and then we give answer to these three questions. Go ahead.
Coincidentally, I am from Venezuela. So
Wow.
hi. The question is quite similar, Mr. Glover. I would like to know your some of the themes that were touched here were very important. Inequality is devastating. Lack of jobs is as well, but it all ends up going towards human rights. Human rights is our basic fundamental right. As it stands right now in Venezuela, we are being shot by the government simply because hundreds and thousands of people are taken to the streets. We would really honestly like to know your position on that, since you've been very close to the Venezuelan government in the past. Thank you.
Okay, so let's attempt answers to those questions. No, we're not gonna go back to you. So you have to let the other people talk. Yeah. So let's attempt some answers to these two questions really: Venezuela and genocide. Who want to go first?
Let me first speak in relationship to Venezuela, because I understand that we often kind of attempt to begin to shape an idea and follow what we see in the corporate press about what's happening in Venezuela, not taking into consideration what has happened over the course of the election process, and what Jimmy Carter said is probably the fairest election in the history of elections, where more than 80% of the population voted, where there was incredible transparency, where there were ways in which there's accountability in the whole process, and the promotion of democracy. That everything that's happening in Venezuela from the time of the Constitution of 1999 has been one way of increasing the body politics, of expanding the body politics within Venezuela. Whether that has to do with the new Constitution of '99, where it in it position the rights of indigenous people and women within the Constitution. So this process, the whole idea of education, free education, the whole idea of healthcare, the reading program initiated to combat literacy, the various other projects that are happening. And when we achieve, understand how change is how people's real life change, how it's defined by political projects that happen. Certainly, we can say that the government in Venezuela, and this is from my information comes from people who actually advise the government. You know, people like Mark Weisbrot from the Institute from the CIPRA, the Center for Economic Policy and Research, or others who advise the government on actions to take. There have been a number of things that have happened in Venezuela, and we don't need to recount them. We know about the coup itself and how women organized, marched down to the palace and said, "We want our president back" in 2002. So we know that there's a constant, a very insidious attempt to destabilize a process. And what does that process mean? How do we change people's expectations, or how do we maintain their, in some sense, elevate their expectations and the role that they play within the democracy when they see it's a real democracy? I had the opportunity when I was there in Venezuela on the 7th of October in 2012 with the election. I had the opportunity to go down to Barlovento, which is a primarily Afro-descendant community. And in fact, it was the seat where the opposition leader had come from there in the election. And I'd sit down and talk to people in that community who were not overjoyed with the reelection of Chavez at that time, but also were overjoyed by the projects that they had, the cooperatives they had formed, the relationships they had formed, and had already assumed another kind of posture, because they knew that the political process, the democratization of the Venezuela was real to them, and they were touched by that and moved by that. People who had been disenfranchised historically now will see themselves as part of a process. That's what I saw. It is in the interest of power to always destabilize those kind of movements that come from the ground up. So that's the reality of it. Let's see what the reality of it. If these movements actually work, even on a visit on a delegation I went one time when I was down there, there were groups that were talking about different ways of re-envisioning prisons within Venezuela as well. So all these are the kind of things that I applaud this in terms of this process. Now, what has happened during this period of destabilization, where it seems as if violence has become the rule of change? We know that the election itself, an election which the U.S. failed to recognize until the OAS, the Organization of American States, decided that it was going to recognize that election, the validity of the election, and then force the United States to be able to put up this resistance that the election was flawed in some sort of way and everything else. So that's the one side of it. So there's been an attempt at every stage over since the inception of this democracy to undermine it, to destabilize it in a sense, mainly because what it does is that we're going to take X amount of resources, we're going to use those resources in the national interests of people, those are oil resources that we have control of, and use those and better in people's lives. And that's the issue. That's the main issue that we're talking about. It's the main issue whether we're talking about it in Venezuela or whether we're talking about the communities here. And that's the issue that we have to deal with. The process, and I'm on my way to Venezuela Wednesday. In a commemoration of the President Chavez's passing. There's a whole program. Jimmy Carter's going down there, other people going down there, because there is a process that is happening. Now, we saw instances, even with the coup in 2002, where there were staged attempts to present the image that it was the government who was initiating the violence. So I think we have to be very, very careful, understanding what is happening in the region itself. Understanding that the region, as most people would say, what is happening over the last decade or more is the best thing that's happening to Latin America's in its almost history. So we have to understand that first of all. So on the one hand, for me to comment on the unfortunate situation that students were shot, I don't have all the information. You gave me one side of the process, or one side of what is happening, not the other aspects that have been happening in every single way with Venezuela. And I think that we have to be, we have to do our due diligence, and it's very important that we do that. When I came down to Venezuela in 2003, the first thing that President Chavez asked about was Haiti. He said, "We owe so much to the Haitian people. We Venezuelans, we Latin Americans owe so much to the Haitian people for what the steps that they took in providing resources as Boulevard, Simon Boulevard went on his campaign to liberate Las Almas. We owe so much to the Haitian people. What can I do? What can I do?" The second thing, when we went down there, because we felt that we had learned through the Conference Against Racism in 2001 and met many groups who were dealing with the issues of Afro-descendants within this new political context. How were their issues met, and how were they addressed in this political context, new political context? We begin to talk about that. First thing that Chavez says is that we did not take into consideration the issues of Afro-descendants, but we can rectify that. He said, "Look at me, look at my hair. My grandmother is African." You know what I'm saying? My grandmother's African, and I think it's important. And he began to plan political projects that in some sense address the issues of Afro-descendants. That's the kind of things that I saw. When I saw these men and women nearly 10 years later in Barlovento, they were an expression of this idea, of the space that was opening up because of this political process. In this sense, where we're in a country where they tried to eliminate people from the voter rolls, where they disenfranchise men and women who have been incarcerated, we have someone who's trying to expand the political process and expand the notion of democracy. And when we look at this, that's a dangerous, because you expand people's expectations of themselves and the expectations of governance as well.